Thank you very much for inviting me, because it got me to read the book sooner rather than later, which is a good thing, as it turns out. First, I wanted to start out by congratulating the authors, because I think this is really quite an accomplishment, and in a lot of different ways. First, you can sit down and read it as a book. And my reading is that it is in the same family that Nancy is trying to argue for, developing that kind of family and approach, and that there's that, where capitalism, where that the emphasis and the choice of scholars and research to emphasize is one that moves more and more toward seeing capitalism not as strictly about capital accumulation, but about all these interconnected things that Nancy was referring to, in a sense doing it on the one hand by a selection of scholars, because when I start to think of the selection of Walter Rodney or C.L.R. James, that gets us a very expanded working class, for not to mention getting racial and gender hierarchies implicated with the development of capitalism, South or North and South. So on the one hand, I mean, and maybe, of course, it's a question for the authors, but at least I'm maybe seeing, because on the one hand, you're trying to, the book is basically going through one theorist after another, and you're trying to do a little bit of justice to the theorists, as well as trying to put in people, not just everybody you agree with, right? But that in the end, what comes out of the book as a whole is very much a picture of capitalism as an evolving and complex system that's a totality, but that is very much interconnected with a broad set of questions, which brings me to my kind of second point, which about the book, just in terms of people who haven't had a chance to look at it yet, because I'm going to be teaching a class on crisis and a class on labor starting next week. I said, God, I should have gotten started earlier looking at this, because in fact, what it does is go through a series of themes, also crisis, labor, development and global inequality, gender and racial hierarchies, and that, so that it's also becomes partly not just a reference volume for social theory, but actually a reference volume for specific thematic courses and syllabi, and a jog to the memory. I think that one nice thing about the book is it's full of tidbits. So on the one hand, it's accessible to people who are relatively new to the field, although it's not, I wouldn't say it's an easy read. I'm not, I think that, but, and at the same time, it has lots of tidbits that people who think they've been in this for a while, you pick up little tidbits about things that I didn't know that, what I guess I had a few, and let me just say on the last thing that's interesting about the book as a whole is this two generations and two sensibilities in terms of the authors, and it actually it's an interesting collaboration. You might want to talk about that a little bit when you respond. But I think that there's something very interesting that comes out of these two different sensibilities of the authors, and the combination of them. I guess it's true. Let me. Anyway, I had a little bit of. I guess I should also mention this thing of the pairings, So again, for people who haven't seen the book yet, that each chapter has pairings, and some of them are very, like, you wouldn't have, like Barrington Moore and Claudia Jones, so anyway, so there's some interesting choices on the pairings, and I think, and for the most part, some of them I don't know, but a lot of times when I looked at the pairing and then when I read the thing, I said, oh, that's actually, that it kind of forces you to think in a new way. So let me, I don't know, I always think I'm going to talk for a short time and then ramble on. Let's see. Okay, I'm not too bad. Yeah, so just a couple of questions. So there's big emphasis in the volume overall on reading capitalism from the global South. And as I think, some of you know, like, I'm quite sympathetic to that. But I'm wondering if, sometimes the reading capitalism from the global South, and this may have been one of the things that Nancy picked up on, right, is, it's reading capitalism from the global South and reading capitalism from the global North. In other words, to what extent does a reading capitalism a whole, or conceptualization of capitalism as a whole, necessarily imply that it's a very also strong reading from the global South? So I'm wondering, to what extent, how you want to, like, kind of emphasize that in the, like, where you want to, I don't know what the relationship between the two is. So I think you can state both, and I think you do state both throughout the book. But so that's one thing. I'll just say once again, because I was going to bring it up. I mean, that on the discussion of labor first, I appreciated in chapter 2 that we're talking about labor, and then in the context of talking about labor, we're talking about the Treaty of Versailles, and you're talking about the Westphalia, and so this relationship between what happens at the point of production and the brutality at the point of production, and how that translates up into a kind of brutality and structures of global governance. So that's, again, something interesting that's there. I mean, they're just, and I mean, of course, if there's just a lot packed in, and some of it is told through other people, and some of it is told directly by the authors themselves, particularly in the introductory and concluding chapters. Again, on labor, I think most of your selections do go to this question of the expanded idea of a working class, not, again, not like factory labor, not like narrow kind of mid-20th century factory labor, male kind of Fordist production as labor. So okay, let me get to two questions that I think are important today, that in the overall. So one is the question of ecology, or environmental crisis or planetary crisis, which I guess my question to the authors is, it's like a little bit annoying, because you've got a 353-page book, right, or 300 and whatever, with the index and everything, even more than that, close to 400. And then I'm saying, well, why, So, but let me not, because I don't have something to say there other than the balance. But let me ask, there's actually something else that I wanted to raise, and I think it's something, because it comes kind of central to your understanding of the specificity and generality of the current crisis. And that's the question of inter-imperialist wars, you know, and how to think about that. And I think that that is actually becoming a big theme within, you know, discussions of the contemporary crisis of capitalism, as well as the ecological climate theme. So, and it has a long history of being understood as something deeply embedded in, interconnected in the dynamics of capitalism and uneven development. And here again, I guess let me just end by saying that I think that there's a lot of interesting things, and I'm not saying you don't have tidbits of it here and there, but even when you talk about Lenin and the introduction and imperialism, you talk about the dividing of the world, but you don't actually say that he saw it as the prelude to major world war, you know. So what I guess, you know, in thinking about capitalism in crisis, there's the question of the generality of crisis, and then there's the question of the specificity. And I don't mean geographical specificity, I mean temporal, you know, so over time, right? There's that not all crises are capitalist crises, but all general crises are capitalist crises, but they're not all exactly the same in terms of how they're provoked and how they're the outcome. So, you know, to the extent that all general crises of capitalism in the past have also led to increased tensions in the geopolitical sphere. I mean, the question is how to think about the current in relation to the past. And then this, you know, brings up the question of China, which, you know, again, some people are trying to make an argument that that the relationship between China and Russia and the United States is the equivalent of, you know, mid-20th century or early 20th century inter-imperialist rivalries, whereas, you know, for example, Arrighi and Adam Smith in Beijing would make a very strong argument that the China path historically is a very different path that makes it implausible to think of what's happening now as a simple repeat of inter-imperialist rivalries of the first half of the 20th century. So to circle back around, that last statement I made requires reading history and theory from a perspective of the global South, right? And then it also requires, you know, thinking of the capitalism as an evolving historical system that's a whole, you know. So let me end there, and with actually, when I was going to do the ecology thing, I was going to say one of my memories of Kristen when she was an undergraduate at Hopkins was on Earth Day. She had taken all, I don't know if you remember this, Kristen, she had taken all of the garbage cans around campus and dumped them on the upper quad, and was showing how people were now putting the recycles in the recyclable, that it was all getting dumped into the regular trash. And so probably your concept of the ecological and that maybe it's evolved also a little bit since then. Like, I don't know whether that would be your top political activity priority to separate out the recyclables, but I still remember you there on the quad doing a big show of the, yeah. So the question, so I guess I'll leave it with the question of where how your thinking has evolved on the ecological question since those days on the upper quad at Hopkins back in the late 90s. Yeah. Okay, thank you.